Yeah, we have with us Lawrence Wilkerson. He is a retired U.S. Army colonel, served as the chief of staff to Colin Powell. And since leaving the Bush administration, he's been outspoken in speaking out against U.S. wars, including the wars that were waged under his administration, namely the Iraq War, and has a wealth of knowledge when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. And he's now currently a professor at the College of William and Mary, and we're very excited to speak to him. Lawrence Wilkerson, thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be with you, Aaron.
As we're speaking right now, peace talks between Russia and Ukraine are still ongoing, and there's conflicting claims coming out of both sides. Some people are saying there's progress, others are saying that there's not. What's your assessment of where things stand right now in this war, more than 1 month into it?
Realize that with regard to your specific question, I'm listening to a lot of rumors, but I do have a few contacts that I trust, both in the Pentagon and at state. And I think Zelensky is using, as I would be doing if I were he, his relationship with NATO and more so with Washington to put pressure on what might be blooming talks. So he says things like, you're not giving me enough support. I need more things. I need jets. I need this. I need that. But most of that is to put pressure on the coming negotiations, which I hear have been aired on both sides. And both sides have more or less agreed. I don't know if I'm talking about Putin, and I don't know if I think I'm talking about Zelensky, but I might not be talking about Putin, at least probably talking about Lavrov, have agreed that, okay, we can sit down. These are negotiable. And if that's the case, then we're to the point where that's exactly what we should do.
Is it your sense that the outcome of this war is basically going to be something like a resolution that could have been reached very easily?
Yes.
To avoid it, basically keeping Ukraine neutral, that's going to be the major outcome of this, something that could have prevented the war to begin with?
Yes. About the time Victoria Nuland made her impolitic remark and it got advertised, I and a number of other people were asked for our views, and we said, I use the phrase studied neutrality. I don't know exactly what that means, but it sounded good. And that was my recommendation for Ukraine. No NATO, no EU at the moment, no Russia. Come to a modus vivendi with both. No arms, no fighting, get rid of the people as best as possible who are disturbing you out in your eastern provinces, mostly neo-Nazis, backed by the CIA and the United States, and be neutral, just be neutral. 15, 20 years of this studied neutrality, if necessary. I think that's probably what Ukraine is probably going to have to lose sovereignty over some of its southern coast on the Black Sea, certainly over the initially disputed oblast in the east, and maybe one or two other aspects of what Russia has done and now holds quite steadily. But at the same time, I think Zelensky should be able, and Washington should be able, to give some things too, like recognition, implicit recognition of Putin's sovereignty over Russia's sovereignty over Crimea, and perhaps one or two other things that maybe you could do that in exchange for Putin's recognition of Kosovo. He's never recognized Kosovo as an independent entity. But there are ways to do this and to come out with reasonable sovereignty and independence and statehood for Ukraine, maybe a little bit of dumb-braided, and to satiate Putin's desires, not to keep him in power or to maintain him in power. But I think, we're looking at a period where I think the Russian people ought to get rid of Putin. Not the United States, not John Bolton, not Tom Cotton, not anybody in this country, and not the CIA for sure. One person called me after the show and said, well, this was a question on the show with Megna. Why can't we just send a cruise missile into Moscow with Putin's name on it? I said, well, first of all, that'd be a violation of international law, violation of the laws of warfare. And you just don't want to start that because other people have cruise missiles too. And by the way, you're more vulnerable than they are.
I show you're referring to a recent appearance you made on a radio program with Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, who was a hero of the Trump impeachment saga, the first one when Trump was impeached for freezing some weapons to Ukraine while pushing Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden. And you got into a bit of a testy exchange with Vindman, who is generally treated in the media with reverence as a hero, and he himself is from Ukraine and has been very vocal in supporting a hawkish policy towards Ukraine. He wants the U.S. to arm Ukraine even more than we currently are.
He mentioned that on the show, and I took some exception to it. He is, as you just described him, he is, I call a Ukrainian patriot. First thing I have problem with that is the same reason I have a problem with Israelis with dual citizenship. I don't like Ukrainian patriots screaming for the United States to sell more weapons, etc. This is just not the way business should be done in the world. It is the way it's done, though, sad to say. And I didn't mention this on the show, but I had a real problem with what he did. He was a serving member of the United States Army. He had his uniform on, for example, when he testified to Congress. And he was essentially testifying against, for political reasons in the Congress, his commander-in-chief. This is unethical to the maximum. He should never have been allowed to do that. He should have been told, okay, if you want to do this, you have to resign your commission and go before the Congress if you want to, but don't do it as a serving military officer, and certainly don't do it in uniform. And that's why he did it. That's very unethical.
And the hubris of the guy, I couldn't believe it, because basically his big complaint about Trump freezing these weapons to Ukraine was that, in his view, Trump was going against official U.S. policy, which was to support Ukraine in the proxy war against Russia, against the Russian-speaking rebels in the East. But isn't it the president, whether you like him or not, who sets U.S. policy, not bureaucrats like Vindman and other people who may not like it?
It's supposed to be. As I teach my students at William and Mary, however, there are many pressures on the president, not least of which are people like Vindman and people like the members of Congress who, frankly, have gone beyond their wit, as far as I'm concerned, in the last decade or so, who are secretaries of state. Indeed, they get up and travel to the countries that are in question or dispute, and they visit them and come back and say, well, I've been there, and Blinken, you're wrong, or Powell, you're wrong. This is, we have, as Powell used to say, we have 535 secretaries of state. This is not the way the founders envisioned this republic working, and yet we are allowing it to happen all the time. I'm worried right now about the pressure on Biden. Biden has the instincts. I know, because we worked with Biden very closely when he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We even went around Dick Lugar, the Republican, and worked with Biden because, as Powell said, Biden knows the issues. And I'm worried about him. He knows right now that we should not be in this war in any sort of big way. Certainly no-fly zones or anything like that. But we should very, and I said this to Megna and Vindman, we should tailor our support so that it is no more than is absolutely necessary. He wants to pour things in there. He wants to send all kinds of weapons in there. No, but there are pressures on Biden. And these pressures are brought by people inside the administration, like Victoria Nuland. Vindman wants her to be the next Secretary of State. Oh my God, I can't imagine a worse choice, except maybe Madeleine Albright, God rest her soul. But here we go with Tom Cotton on the outside, with General Breedlove on the outside. Breedlove was taking his motorcycle gangs into places in as early as 06, 07, 08. And I think working with the CIA to arm those neo-Nazis and others who were contesting Russian control in the ethnic Russian regions of Ukraine. So this is another man who's really been violating his rights as a general officer, if you will. But I suggest he's probably been doing it in conjunction with the CIA. So we aren't, he's got influences on him, Biden does. And these influences want regime change in Moscow. And they want it tomorrow morning. They wanted it yesterday.
Just to clarify, by Dearlove, you're referring to Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6?
No, this is the former command Breedlove. I'm sorry, I got the name wrong. Breedlove.
Oh, my fault.
I was thinking of Dearlove too. Breedlove. He's
Breedlove,
the general, Air Force general, who was in charge of the United States European Command for 4 years. He reminds me of Powell's old saying about never put an Air Force general in charge of anything but an airplane.
You mentioned that these people want regime change. What did Biden mean when he said about Putin, for God's sake, this man cannot be allowed to remain in power? Was that a Freudian slip? Was that a shooting
It
from
was a
the hip?
it
What was
was
that?
an extemporaneous remark. I think Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, confirmed that. But Tony did his best to walk it back and to say, that was his emotion, that was his passion. He genuinely feels this. I don't think President Biden is willing to accept the immediate deposing of the leader of Russia, unless it's done by the Russian people. If it's done by the Russian people, we should have nothing to say about it. We can applaud, but nothing to say about it in essence. These people like Bolton and others, they want him brought down by any means necessary. In fact, they would probably be in favor of sending a cruise missile in there. We did that in the Iraq War. We sent two B-2s. Both had 2,000-pound satellite guided bombs, and they were to kill Saddam Hussein. They went and their bombs hit the target, and they killed 33 or 34 civilians at Dora Farms. Your intelligence is never as good as you think it is.
He just wasn't there?
He wasn't there. And to think that during the 19-hour flight of these B-2s from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri to Baghdad, he was going to wait around. I mean, he's got intel too,
What do you make of Russia's war strategy so far? There was a recent article in Newsweek magazine by Bill Arkin, which quoted some U.S. officials, including one analyst with the Defense Intelligence Agency, who basically said that Putin has been, in the opinion of this analyst, has been restrained so far, focusing mostly on military targets. And their read on Putin's strategy was that Russia wants to leave room for negotiations here. Do you agree with that? And what do you make of Russia's military approach so far? We keep hearing in the U.S. that Russia has had its plans thwarted, that it wanted to decapitate the government in Kiev, but it wasn't able to because of fierce Ukrainian resistance. How do you read all that?
I think it has gone rather poorly for the Russians, not in the sense that they haven't achieved most of their objectives. I think they probably have, but in the sense that the conscripts don't quite do as well as they were expected to do. And that's just, we had these conversations with the Russians in 91 and 92. We told them one of the things they needed to do was create an NCO corps. They don't have any. So you have officers who have to go down to the front lines and act like they're NCOs. And that's why you have so many general officers, if the record is right in our media, being wounded or killed. But I think basically they've achieved what they wanted to achieve. And that's why I think negotiations should be able to take place now. Their main
Colonel, what does NCO stand for?
Non-commissioned officers.
Okay.
Yeah, E6s, E7s. The people who sort of run the thing. They don't have any. They simply have a different structure and a different way of running things. And it maybe could be said to be very powerful in the defense. It's not that powerful in the offense, because in the offense you need a hell of a lot more coordination and cooperation between what is the tactical element and the operational element. In the defense, you're all together and you're fighting for your life. Clausewitz said the stronger form of warfare is defense, and he's right, but he also said it's a negative. That is to say, you're not gaining anything except maybe your own preservation. But the defense is a far stronger form of war, and if you're Ukraine, that's good.
What do you think the United States' role should be, to the extent that it should have one in this conflict right now?
Well, it shouldn't be as it is right now with those forces outside the presidency, and maybe even the president himself to an extent. It is, let's do everything we can to attrit Putin, to attrit his military, to do as much damage to him as we can. And let's get this over with and hope Putin falls, and maybe even Putin will fall. That's their attitude. It shouldn't be that. It should be, let's end this conflict because we have much more important matters to get to, not least of which is nuclear arms control. We've abandoned it, not least of which, too, is the climate crisis. As the heads of delegation for both Ukraine and Russia to the IPCC meeting that delivered its report on 28 February, both said, brave man, that Russian, he condemned the invasion and said, this is crazy. Why are we doing this? we're fighting in Ukraine, at least in part, over the very things that are going to kill us all, fossil fuels. And I hope he's still alive when he got back to Moscow.
And what would it look like for the United States to be pushing for diplomacy or peace? What would that look like in terms of what the U.S. government would be doing and the military would be doing?
Well, I think if Zelensky is playing things right now to gain maximum leverage before real talks start, I think we should just be backing him up, not militarily, to the extent we are, yes, but no further. No further. Let's don't escalate at all. And let's let him say things like, oh, give me planes, give me this, and let the Russians think that we might do it. That's fine to bring pressure on the negotiations, but don't do it. Don't really do it. Just stay with him in terms of the negotiations and encourage him to do whatever he has to do to get in there and get the maximum leverage and get the thing ended.
You mentioned arms control. So I'm curious your thoughts on how that has fueled this conflict, how that played into Putin's decision to invade. Since 2003, starting with the Bush administration, which you served under, John Bolton was instrumental in dismantling the anti-ballistic missile treaty.
Yep.
And since then, we've seen the demise of the conventional forces in Europe treaty, another major arms control pact. Under Trump, the U.S. abandoned the INF treaty, which had eliminated an entire class of missiles in the U.S. and Russian stockpiles. Trump also killed the Open Skies Treaty. How has that background played into this crisis? And I'm curious if you remember, was there any debate under the Bush administration over Bolton's genius idea to destroy the anti-ballistic missile treaty?
You left out one. Trump almost killed New START.
That's right.
Had it not been for Putin and his openness to doing it, because he understood this was the mother of all arms control agreements, we probably wouldn't have done that.
That's right.
But you're right. Under the Bush administration, when we got rid of the ABM treaty, it made Powell apoplectic. No one had forewarned us. And we all knew, he and I, particularly being military professionals, that ballistic missile defense was enormously expensive and probably technically infeasible. That is to say, 10 missiles coming at you, you might stop 2. The other 8 are probably going to get through, and they have nuclear warheads. You're dead. You're very dead. So it was $80 billion for some of these suites we were fielding in South Korea and so forth. It was nonsense, but Bush wanted to get rid of it, and he wanted to get rid of it in order to build ballistic missile defense. And so what Powell did as a counter, he sent Bolton, this was Machiavellian, he sent Bolton to Moscow to do it. He developed the Moscow Treaty, which was a 2-page treaty that essentially picked up on the momentum that had been generated by the end of the Cold War, where we were actually destroying Russian warheads, helping them. And we agreed in that treaty to go down from what we were at that point, which was roughly 15,000 apiece or so after the destruction. We were at 30,000 apiece when we started, to about 1,200. And that was going apace until we started doing what you just said. And Putin got scared. We got scared, I guess, because he was developing tactical nuclear weapon doctrine to use them. So we had to have counters. So we had to leave the INF treaty to build that class of missile again. It's nonsense. It's insanity what we've done. People have forgotten what it was like to live in the Cold War. They've forgotten about escalation theory. So the Russians actually call their theory escalate to de-escalate. What nonsense. You're firing a nuclear weapon to convince your enemy that you're serious enough to where he'll de-escalate. Okay, he's going to fire one back at you. I mean, we learned that during the Cold War. We learned it with India and Pakistan. We came very dangerously close in 2002 to an exchange. And when we started talking to Musharraf in Islamabad and his equivalents in Delhi, they began to understand that what we were saying was, you people are neophytes. You don't understand this. Let us explain it to you. They didn't even have permissive action logs, PALs, on their nuclear weapons. That keeps, 2 keys, keeps people from being able to access them in a dangerous way, at least. We're in a mess right now with regard to nuclear weapons arms control, and we need to bring others in. We need to force Israel in. We need to force North Korea in. And when I say force, we need to make the deal so rich and sweet that they can't resist it. And we need all 9 countries that are weapons states in the regime that we build. It'll take a while, but we need them. We need China. We need the UK and France. We need all the nuclear weapon powers in a very close-knit group. And then we need to reinforce or replace the non-proliferation treaty so that it has more teeth.
What made you, this is shifting gears a little bit, but it's, I think, related. What made you change your view of the Iraq War, including your own role in it?
That's a good question. It's fairly complex to answer it. I was actually, if you saw the movie Shock and Awe, I was the person called the source in that movie. I used former UPI reporter and then working for Knight Ridder, Joe Galloway, who died a few months ago. I used him to conduit my information. And Knight Ridder was the only group of newspapers in America that really got it right. And they got it right because Joe took what we said and wrote. And I wasn't the only contact he had. Karen Kiewatowski at the Pentagon was a contact. But we were, and in doing that and in going over it with people at Knight Ridder and with Joe himself, I began to understand how stupid it was. I was at the point where, and I wrote out, Dear Mr. President, I was a political appointee. So, Dear Mr. President, I resigned. I wrote out my letter and I put it in the central drawer of my desk. And then that was impacted really significantly when Powell thought he was going to leave. And I thought, well, we're in concert here, because he had told me when I took the job as chief of staff, if I leave, you leave. You can't stay. You're a political appointee just like me if you take the chief of staff job, and you have to leave. So I was elated. I wasn't the only one who was elated. The Deputy Secretary of State, Richard Armitage, when I walked into his office after the 2004 reelection of George W. Bush, looked at me and said, damn, I'm really pissed off. And I said, Rich, what's wrong? He said, we won. I said, that's counterintuitive. He said, I want out of here. I don't want to work for these Nazis. His term. So there were a lot of us who wanted out. I just didn't have the courage to submit my letter. And my wife taught me out of it to a certain extent, because she said, if you leave, there'll be no one left to protect his rear end. And I said, you got a point. But
his rear end
him being Powell.
Colin Powell.
Yeah. I look back on it now and I wish I had, because at least I could put that on the wall and say, I left because it was so bad.
And to hear the rest of the interview, please go to usefulidiots.substack.com.